Good evening, everyone. Very warm welcome to the Oxford Martin School. I'm Ian Golden. I'm the director of the school, and it's an enormous pleasure this evening to be welcoming members of the Oxford International Relations Society and other friends to the Oxford Martin School, and particularly to be welcoming Professor Joe Stiglitz, who's going to be the guest. Joe Nye, the other Joe. The other Joe, that's a member of our advisory board. Different views, I would say they have. Joe Nye, who's been a wonderful supporter of the school and has been engaged with us on many, many occasions. So it's a huge pleasure to have you all here. I hope you come to many of our events. I hope you engage with the school. And I'd like to welcome Daniel Bayliss, the president of the Society, to come to the stage and introduce Professor Nye. Daniel is an international relations student at Oxford, tremendous effectiveness in everything he does, and not least in his organization in the society. So thank you very much, Daniel, for coming to the Oxford Martin School with your society tonight, and I'll give you the floor.
Thank you very much, Ian, for your kind introduction. And a very good evening to you all. Thank you very much for coming this evening. And a very warm welcome to all those of you who are watching via live webcast this evening. Thank you also for joining us. It is great and really exciting to see such a big turnout to IRSoc's final speaker event of this term. And it is an absolute honour to be hosting the brilliant and inspirational man that is Joseph Nye. I hope you managed to buy a copy of his latest book on your way in today, entitled Is the American Century Over? I hope that you also found a shiny new, hot-off-the-press issue of IRSoc's termly journal, Sir, on your chairs. The theme of our latest edition is Visions, Our Forecasts for the World in 2030. Hence Joseph's speech to us this evening, offering his opinion on whether or not China will pass the US by 2030. We're now 15 years into the 21st century. What will the world look like in another 15 years? A few very brief things from me before we start the event. Firstly, I would like to thank IRSoc's long-standing sponsor, Morgan Stanley, and in particular, I would like to thank the Brussels School of International Studies at the University of Kent for sponsoring our SIR journal, and especially for kindly sponsoring this SIR launch event tonight. Secondly, please do get involved on Twitter tonight, especially those of you watching online. Twitter is a great way to contribute your opinions and reactions to what is said this evening, and you'll hopefully it'll help you to feel part of the event, even if you can't be with us in person. You can find IRSoC using the handle @OxfordIRSoC, the OMS @OxMartinSchool, Joseph Nye @Joe_Nye, and the hashtag we'll be using this evening is #Nye2030. So please do get involved. Thirdly, in terms of the format of tonight's event, Joseph will be giving a speech for around 30 minutes or so before I will introduce Rupert York, the editor of SIR. Rupert will conduct a short 10 minutes discussion with Joseph before Rupert will open up the floor to a Q&A session with yourselves. And now I would like to introduce you all to the man himself. Joseph Nye is an American political scientist and is currently one of the leading and most influential international relations scholars in the world. I study history and politics, and Joseph's works often appear on my reading lists for both disciplines. He co-founded the neoliberal theory of IR and founded himself the now well-known concepts of soft power and smart power, often referred to by policymakers and government administrations today. Joseph received his bachelor's degree in public affairs from Princeton University in 1958, won a Rhodes Scholarship to study PPE here at Oxford until 1960, and earned a PhD in political science from Harvard in 1964. Since 1964, Joseph has been a member of the Harvard faculty. He is now currently a University Distinguished Service Professor at Harvard, a visiting professor and honorary fellow here at Oxford, a member of the Oxford Martin School's Advisory Council, and he serves as a director of the Council on Foreign Relations, in addition to many, many other great and important roles. Some of Nye's most noteworthy previous roles in his career include being Dean of the Harvard Kennedy School of Government, the Assistant Secretary of Defense for International Security Affairs, Chair of the National Intelligence Council, Chair of the National Security Council Group on the Non-Proliferation of Nuclear Weapons, and Deputy Undersecretary of State for Security Assistance, Science and Technology. In 2008, a poll of 2,700 international relations scholars listed him as the most influential scholar on American foreign policy, and a 2011 poll rated him the fourth most influential scholar in IR over the past 20 years. What is significant, though, is that Nye is considered to be so influential in IR thought, not only by fellow IR scholars, but also by policymakers. Indeed, he's the author of over 13 books and 150 articles. It is clear now, I hope, that Joseph is a remarkable man, a rigorous academic, and certainly well placed to lead tonight's discussion in international relations. Speaking to us specifically about whether China will or will not pass the US by 2030, please show your appreciation for and give a very warm Oxford welcome to Joseph S. Nye.
Thank you very much, Daniel, and thank you, Ian. It's a pleasure to be back at Oxford and to be here at the Martin School. And I aim to keep my remarks brief enough so that we'll have plenty of time for questions and interaction with the audience. The question of whether China will pass the U.S. Is a question which some people think is already settled. There's a book by Martin Jacques which has an interesting title which makes his conclusion. The title of the book is When China Rules the World. And if you look at a poll that was taken recently in the United States, it showed that something in the range of 50% of the American people thought that China had already passed or would soon pass the United States in overall power. So for those people, there's not a question, there's an answer. Indeed, the Financial Times, in a headline of April of last year, had a headline saying China is now larger as an economy than the United States. I'll come back to that and tell you why I think there's some problems with it, but there is a strong view that this is not an open question, it's a question that is settled. I don't agree with that conclusion, and I'll try to explain to you why. And in the book, which was mentioned is The American Century Over, you can see some of the details and facts and figures if I don't impress you with them from the podium. But the point that I think is important that you think about is, why does it matter? Who cares? After all, being able to have bragging rights is not particularly interesting or important. I think one of the things that's important, though, is to have an accurate assessment of the relative strengths of different powers so that there are clear perceptions that guide policy. I'm sure all of you are familiar with your history of the Peloponnesian War, in which Thucydides explained why the Greek city-state system tore itself apart in the 5th century BC. And the answer which Thucydides gave was it was caused by the rise in the power of Athens and the fear that created in Sparta. And similarly, many people say that World War I, a century ago, was caused by the rise in the power of Germany and the fear that created in Britain. Now, that's rather an oversimplification of the causes of World War I, but it is interesting that there are people who are taking those two examples of the Peloponnesian War and World War I and extrapolating to our century and saying that China cannot rise peacefully. For example, John Mearsheimer, a distinguished political scientist at the University of Chicago, has written flat out, China cannot rise peacefully. And if you accept that and you believe that China is about to pass the United States, then that would lead you to believe that this could be a century that has in its earlier stage some sort of major conflict, which could be extremely damaging, not just to China and to the United States, but to the world as a whole. So the issue that we're talking about is, has China passed the United States, or will it pass the United States, is more than just about bragging rights. It's about how do we understand the prospects for stability in the international system at the beginning of this century. If one looks at the view that the United States is over, that the American century is over, the title of my book is a question mark, is the American era over, the American century over? Many people started with the view that the United States is in decline, and that it's worth remembering, though, before you take those things too seriously, is that Americans have always worried about decline. Indeed, if you go back to the very beginnings of the United States, there was a question as the British colonists who broke away from the Church of England and went to Massachusetts, as they thought about the more pure religion which these Puritans were trying to create, they kept asking themselves right at the start, were they up to it, or were they declining from their high ideals? And the founding fathers, George Washington and Thomas Jefferson and others, who were resisting the idea of that monarchy was the natural form of government and were trying to start a republican form of government, they were too worried about decline. They spent a lot of time studying ancient Rome because they were concerned not about the decline of the Roman Empire, but the decline of the Roman Republic. They were fearing that they would lose their republican virtues. And more recently, in the 20th century, you'll see that the United States has had cycles in which it is worried about decline. For example, when the Soviet Union put up Sputnik in 1957, that led to a wave of belief that that was the end of the United States. The United States was in decline. And when Japan proved to have a superior manufacturing technology and system in the 1980s, there was a feeling that, as one of my colleagues put it in the title of the book, Japan is number one, and that showed the Americans were in decline. Or if you go more recently, you can say that after the Great Recession of 2008, in which you had the United States having this serious recession and China using a major stimulus package to keep its growth rate at 10%, that was the proof that the curves had crossed. The Americans were going downhill. China was now in the ascendant, which helps to explain something like that poll which I mentioned. But what I would say is that these various polls and moods tell us more about psychology than about reality. They don't really tell us about power relations. They tell us about the odd psychology of Americans. And I think in that sense, it's better to stop and look more at facts to try to understand whether the United States is in decline and therefore China's rise will pass the United States. When we talk about decline, it's very important to distinguish between absolute decline and relative decline. They're often confused in terms, but absolute decline is what happened to ancient Rome. Rome didn't succumb to the rise of a new empire. It succumbed basically to internecine warfare and to the fact that it had no productivity growth in its economy, and that meant it couldn't defend itself against the hordes of barbarians that were sweeping in from Germany. And in that sense, people sometimes will say, look at the American political system today, look at the gridlock, look at the battles in Washington, isn't this just like ancient Rome? But in fact, it's not. It's a metaphor which is often used by editorial writers, but it's something of a misuse of history. Look at the facts of the American situation compared to a Roman economy that had no productivity. Well, start with demography. One of the things that's interesting is that demographically, the United States is in pretty good shape. If you rank countries by the size of their population today, the ranking is China is number one, India is number 2. The United States is number 3. When you ask what do UN demographers project for the year 2050, India is number 1, China is number 2, but the United States is still number 3. Now, what's intriguing about that is the United States is the only large, rich country which will maintain its relative rank in terms of population size. This is important because it also means the population will be younger than in other rich countries. So Europe, Russia, Japan, and other countries which are essentially going to have fewer and fewer productive workers of younger generations supporting an older generation, that won't be as much the case in the United States. So demographically, the U.S. is in pretty good shape. Look also at energy. 10 years ago, we were discussing the condition of the United States. You would say, well, the United States is becoming hopelessly dependent upon imported energy, particularly from the Middle East. And when you look at the situation today, you'll notice that the International Energy Agency projects that North America may not be importing energy at all in the 2020s. And the result of that was through technological innovation, in which the technologies of horizontal drilling and hydraulic fracturing have been applied to shale and created the so-called shale revolution, which has unleashed a huge amount of oil and gas, which was there all the time, but until the technology was developed, it wasn't available. That's a quite amazing change from a projection that just a decade ago was of increased dependence and weakness. Or take a third point, which is if you look at the technologies that will be key to the 21st century, most people would say that biotechnology, nanotechnology, the next generation of information technology will be crucial to the nature of growth in the 21st century. And if you ask what country is on the forefront of all three of those technologies, it's the United States. And behind that is the question of the educational structure, particularly higher education, in which if you look at the rankings of world universities, let's say as conducted by Shanghai Jiao Tong University, do we have an unbiased source, they rank of the top 20 universities in the world, they rank 15 as being in the United States and none in China. So if you ask, is this like ancient Rome? No. It's a nice thing for an editorial writer to put that in the headline to complain about political gridlock, but in fact, it's a misuse of history to say that there's an absolute decline in the U.S. like there was in ancient Rome. There is a different dimension of decline, though, which is the question of relative decline, which is, will the United States be as powerful relative to all the other countries as it has been in the past? And there you can either see it as relative decline, that the U.S. share will be somewhat less, or you can see it as the rise of the rest. And in fact, if you look at the rise of the rest, which is not just China, but also India, Brazil, Indonesia, and many other countries, you can make a case that the United States share of the world economy will be somewhat less than in the past. It's interesting, though, to take a long perspective on this. If you look at the 20th century, the United States had become the largest economy in the world by the beginning of the 20th century, about a quarter of the world economy. After World War II, when almost everybody was laid low by World War II, but the United States economy was boosted by the war, the United States became nearly half of the world economy. By the end of the 20th century, it returns to the same level of about 25% that it had at the beginning of the century. Ironically, in the middle of the century, many people saw that as American decline, so that Richard Nixon and Henry Kissinger, two quite astute observers of international relations, in 1970 declared the world was multipolar and that the United States was in decline. Well, if you just took the line from 1945, when the U.S. was about half the world economy, and drew that line to 1970, indeed, that was decline. It was also partly a policy objective. That's what the Marshall Plan and an open international system was about, which was the rise of the rest. But Nixon and Kissinger assumed that straight line would just continue on forever, and in fact it didn't. Rather than the world being multipolar at the end of the 20th century, it turned out to be unipolar because of the collapse of the Soviet Union. So we have to be very careful when we take a trend line and just extrapolate it as though it's going to stay at the same trend indefinitely into the future. But in any case, if you look at the prospects at the 21st century, I think it is realistic to say that there will be a rise of the rest, and that rise of the rest will mean the American share of the world economy will be somewhat less than it is now. If the United States entered the 21st century with about 23% of the world economy, the IMF projects that perhaps in the 2020s, it'll be more like 17 or 18%. Still impressive, but not as dominant as it was in an earlier period. What's interesting about that is not just the question of the rise of China, which I'm about to come to, but the rise of others as well as China. Because what it leads to is a question of, as you have more countries that are involved in the world economy and having a power, how do you get collective goods produced? Collective goods are things from which anybody can benefit, but very often they're underproduced because why produce these? You can benefit from them anyway. It's easier just to be a free rider. And unless the largest countries produce collective goods, they're not going to be produced adequately. And that's a great problem of the international system. So as you have the rise of the rest, the interesting question is, will you have the capacity to get work done, whether it's on collective goods like dealing with climate change, or whether it's on international monetary stability, or dealing with the spread of pandemics, or countering terrorism, or dealing with cyber theft, and so forth. If the largest country doesn't take a role or lead on this, it's unlikely that these collective goods will be adequately produced. And in that sense, the danger in relative decline is, one danger is, will another country like China pass the United States and therefore create a conflict? The other danger is what you might call entropy, the inability to get work done. And I would argue, and I'm about to make the argument, that to me, the greater question in the title of my book, Is the American Century Over?, is how do we deal with entropy, not will China pass us? In other words, to my mind, the greater threat is entropy, not China. But many people, as I said at the beginning, disagree with that and say that China will indeed be the next successor and will run the century, and therefore China will produce the collective goods. I don't think so. I think that, in fact, the more likely problem is that China will be a free rider, as the United States was in the 1920s and 30s. Remember, the Americans came out of World War I with the largest economy and being the most powerful nation, but what did they do over the next 20 years? They took a free ride. Britain, which had been the producer of most collective goods in that period before World War I, was no longer able to produce the goods, would no longer play the role that it had before, and instead of stepping up as the United States should have done, the United States essentially was a free rider, and in the 1930s we went through a period of very strong isolationism, which meant we failed to counteract the rise of Hitler, which was a real and major danger, which had terrible effects on the world. And it really wasn't until after World War II, in 1945 to 1947, when President Truman, instead of bringing troops back home, basically took Britain's role in the Eastern Mediterranean when Britain couldn't afford it, started the Marshall Plan, started NATO, and in that sense, the Americans became central to the global balance of power after that period and have remained so to this day. It's interesting that troops remain in Europe, in Japan, and Korea, and elsewhere throughout this period. But the question that we want to deal with this evening is that going to continue? And if we take the statement by Henry Luce, who was the editor of Time magazine, who proclaimed, in his words, the American century in 1941, what will it look like 100 years later? In 2041, will it still be an American century, or will it be, as Martin Jock and others say, a Chinese century? Well, I think, in fact, that there's been a great exaggeration of Chinese power. And I think that there are several reasons for this. One is there is a tendency to do the same mistake of taking a straight line and extrapolating indefinitely into the future. China has had a wonderful record over the last 30 years or so of having a very high rate of economic growth, double-digit growth, which has raised hundreds of millions of people out of poverty, a major accomplishment for all to applaud. But the question is, how long will that continue? Or do we make the mistake of just projecting that into the future? Well, China's growth this year is 7%, with Prime Minister Li Keqiang has said is the new normal. But is it really the new normal, or will it in fact go lower than this? Larry Summers, my colleague at Harvard, and Lant Pritchett, another colleague at Harvard, have done an estimate of what's happened to other countries which have had double-digit growth in the past. And they say the norm is to go back to the average, to what the economists call regression to the mean. If that's true, the mean for these other countries, the average for these other countries after the period of double-digit growth, would project Chinese growth in the next decade or so to be about 3.9%. Now, nobody knows what the right answer is, but the point is that just to take 10% or 7% and draw a line into the future is not a very good way of projecting what will happen. If you look at the headline that I mentioned in the Financial Times that said a year ago, based on World Bank and IMF studies, that China had passed the US, it's worth noticing that that headline was based on purchasing power parity, which is an adjustment that economists make to official figures to measure comparative welfare in different economies. It's valid for those purposes. But if you're importing oil or importing jet engines, you pay for them at exchange rates, not at purchasing power parity. And if you compare the United States and China's economy last year or this year at exchange rates, the United States is still considerably larger than China. So one problem is the kind of headline which is based on a special type of number, not another. But suppose that we leave that aside and say at some point, won't China growing at 4 or 5% and the United States growing at 2.5%, won't China be larger than the US? And the answer to that is probably yes. And different economists have made different guesses about when that would be. A few years ago, when the conventional wisdom was to take this straight line and extrapolate it, the London economists said it would happen by about 2019. Now that the Chinese economy is slow, the American economy is doing a little better, people are saying, well, no, it'll be the late 2020s. There's an economist at Rand who says, no, it'll wait until the 2040s. We don't know the answer. But the point is that all these questions of when will China be larger than the US depend upon the assumptions you put in about the rate of growth and the slope of those curves. But even if you say, I'll pick a number, let's say 2030 or 2035, as the point where China's economy will be bigger than the United States in total size, that's not necessarily a measure of China being economically more powerful than the United States. Size of your market is one dimension of economic power. If you have a large market, you can get leverage through controlling access. You can also get leverage through investing the product of that economy into the military and so forth. So economic size is important as a dimension of power. It's not the only measure of economic power. You can also look at per capita income. And per capita income gives you a better measure of the sophistication of an economy. And in per capita income, China is about 1/4 of the United States. And even if there's a date, let's call it 2030, where China's total size is larger than the United States, its per capita income will not be equal to the United States. Now, what do I mean when I talk about sophistication of an economy? Let me give you an example from trade. In 2012, China passed Germany as the world's largest trading nation. That's very impressive. But it's also worth noticing that there's a problem with China's trade, which is much of the composition of its trade has a low value added. So if you ask yourself, if you take a device like this, an iPhone, and you say, this is an import from China. Yes, made in China. Made in China with components from other Asian countries and with intellectual property rights and marketing paid to the United States. So if you ask how much of the value added of this $700 import from China goes to Chinese, the answer is about 5%. So here is something where if you think about the sophistication of economy, as some Chinese put it, they're much better at creating jobs than at creating Steve Jobs. And they're making changes in this, it's improving, but when we do these measurements and comparisons, we want to look not just at aggregate figures, but at composition of trade or composition of an economy. So in that sense, as we look at China's economic power, it will probably be larger than the US at some point. We don't know the exact date. Let's call it 2030 around, plus or minus. But even then, not necessarily more powerful than the US in terms of overall economic power. The other point to notice is that when we talk of power, power has several dimensions. If power is the ability to affect others to get what you want, you can do it through coercion, you can do it through payment, and you can do it through attraction, or what I call soft power. We've talked about payment, or essentially economic power. Let's talk about coercive power, military power. If you look at military power, the United States spends on its budget about 4 times what China does. Now, China has been increasing its military budget by over 10% a year for the past decade, which means that the gap between China's military budget and the US budget will narrow over time. But the idea that within, let's say, a couple of decades, that China will be able to have a military of the scale of the United States, which will have the ability to project military power globally, is, I think, very unlikely. So if you looked at the trends in military power, China will increase its capacity, but much of that capacity will be focused on the local area, on the seas around China, rather than a global capacity. Or another way of thinking about that is China will be increasingly dependent upon imported oil, particularly from the Middle East. And the Chinese naval improvements will mean China will have greater capacity to protect the sea lanes through the Straits of Malacca. But when you go to the Straits of Hormuz in the Gulf, it's more likely it's still going to be the American Navy, not the Chinese Navy, that will be dominant. So in military power, I don't see China passing the US in that dimension either. And finally, let me turn to the third dimension of soft power, this ability to get what you want through attraction. China has been investing heavily in its soft power. In 2007, President Hu Jintao said that China needed to invest in soft power, and it has been spending billions of dollars to do so, creating Confucius Institutes, turning Chinese central television into a 24/7 type of cable news and so forth. But one of the interesting things is that China has not gotten a very good return on its investment. And this is judged by polls taken by the BBC, the Pew Charitable Trust, and elsewhere, where it shows American soft power in Asia, but Europe and other areas higher than Chinese soft power. Why is this? It seems to me that there are two problems that China faces in terms of developing its soft power. One is Chinese officials often think that soft power is a product of the government, and they don't realize that a great deal of a country's soft power comes from its civil society, not from its government. So if you look at American soft power or British soft power, it comes more from, let's say, universities and foundations and cultural products than it comes from broadcasts or propaganda. But so long as the Chinese Communist Party insists on censoring civil society for political reasons, it's limiting the creativity of Chinese civil society. The other problem for China's developing its soft power is it has a number of conflicts with its neighbors, territorial conflicts with Japan, with Vietnam, with Philippines, with India, and just to mention a few. And that has a difficult effect on Chinese soft power. If you go to the Philippines and you create a Confucius Institute in Manila to advance the attractiveness of traditional Chinese culture, and at the same time you send your naval ships to chase Philippine fishing boats out of the Scarborough Shoal, which the Philippines believes is within its 200-mile economic zone, you're not going to generate a lot of soft power through your Confucius Institute. And China would do far better to drop many of these conflicts, but it's difficult because of the role of nationalism in China. If the legitimacy of the Chinese Communist Party has rested in the past on a high rate of economic growth plus nationalism, and if the rate of economic growth is likely to decline, it's plausible that the role of nationalism will increase. That makes it very difficult to compromise on these issues that we've been reading about recently in the South China Sea. So I don't see China passing the US in soft power either, unless it is able to overcome those barriers. And I don't think those barriers are likely to be overcome in the next few decades. So I would summarize that by saying that, and I give you facts and figures in much greater detail in the chapter on China in my book, I would say that China is not likely to pass the United States in the next quarter century. I don't know what the situation will be beyond that, but just pick a quarter century, because that's 2041, which is a century after Henry Luce's proclamation of the American century. Now, again, to go back to where I started, why does that matter? Or does it matter? And is it accurate? I once did a reality check on this by talking to Lee Kuan Yew about this, and he's an astute, or was an astute observer of both China and the United States. And I said, what do you think? Do you think China will pass the United States in the next quarter century or so? He said, no, I don't think they will. He said, they'll give you a run for your money, but I don't think they're going to pass you. I said, why do you think that? He said, well, China can draw upon the talents of 1.3 billion people, but the United States can draw upon the talents of 7 billion people. And what's more, it can recombine them in a diversity which leads to greater creativity than you can get with ethnic Han nationalism. This statement by an ethnic Han individual. I think there's something in that, which is that if the United States remains open and keeps its traditions, then I think the numbers that I gave you and this sort of intuitive judgment of Lee Kuan Yew are probably correct. But to go back to where I started, why does it matter? If you go back to that analogy that's sometimes made about World War I and Britain succumbing to fear of a rising Germany, It's worth noticing that Germany had passed Britain in industrial production by 1900. So not only was Germany not merely champing at Britain's heels, it had actually passed Britain. And the uncertainties related to German foreign policy, plus its enormous capabilities, led to the type of anxieties that we saw in 1914. If my analysis tonight is correct, then China is not like Germany in the early part of the 20th century, because China is not passing the United States. And if that's true, then there's time for the Americans to avoid the kinds of fears that precipitated World War I and to manage this relationship without it breaking out into conflict. So the pessimistic view that the rise of China can't be peaceful, that conflict is inevitable, I reject that. I think, in fact, the United States' job to do with China is to figure out how to work cooperatively with China so that we don't see a period of entropy. China, as it grows and increases in its capabilities, is going to have to be part of the solution to things like climate change, like dealing with pandemics, like global monetary stability, like dealing with terrorism. And in that sense, the relationship between China and the US will have both competitive and cooperative dimensions. And we shouldn't become so fearful over the competitive dimensions that we fail to realize that we have far more to gain from working together on these cooperative dimensions. So the major question for me in this book that I've tried to argue is not will China pass the US? I think I assert or demonstrate with facts and figures that the answer to that is no. But how do we assure that as you have the rise of the rest, particularly the rise of China, how do we organize in such a way that we avoid entropy, that we don't have free riders, that collective goods are produced? To me, that is the real question of what happens at the end of the American century. So the answer to my own question in the title of the book, is the American century over, is no, but it's going to be very, very different than it was when Henry Luce produced it. And the key question is going to be how we manage that type of change. So with that set of thoughts, I've given you my answer to the question, but I will welcome your rebuttals or curious questions. So over to you. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Joseph, for a hugely interesting and thought-provoking speech. I would now like to invite the current editor of IRSoc's termly journal, Sir, to the stage to join Joseph in a discussion before we open the floor to a Q&A session. Please welcome Rupert York.
Thanks, Daniel, for a very kind introduction, and thank you, Joseph, for agreeing to coincide your talk with the launch of Sir. It's a great privilege, I think, for any student to discuss these issues with someone so eminent in the international relations sort of sphere, so I'm very grateful. I came up with visions as the theme for Sir in the winter. I was looking through family albums, and I found one in 2000 when my brother and mother and I visited Cairo. And typically some awkward photos by the pyramids and the Sphinx and looking a bit silly. And I thought to myself, wow, would we go there now? And the answer is probably not. And so I thought, so what will the world look like in 15 years' time again, in 2030? And I think we've just heard a pretty compelling, fascinating vision of the most, well, arguably the most important power relationship in the world, that between China and the United States. And whilst you paint a relatively positive picture for the United States itself as it moves forward in the next few decades, I wonder about the United States-built system itself and what's called often the post-Second World War sort of liberal international order and how that is surviving. And so my first question to you would be about this order itself and how that will how that will survive into the next few decades. For two reasons mainly. Firstly is recent American foreign policy decisions in the past 15 years, of course, in Iraq, in the Kyoto climate change agreements, the recent Trans-Pacific Partnership, foreign policies which are seen by many to be illiberal and not up to the standard of what people desire. Secondly, China increasingly seems to be taking on the role of providing these global public goods, which you say. The recent, I'm sure everyone knows, the Asian Investment Infrastructure Bank, economic investment in Africa, Latin America, UN peacekeeping as well. So my first question, Joseph, would be, how do you envisage this order surviving, let alone the United States itself?
Well, there are people who argue that the order that was created, the so-called Bretton Woods system after World War II, is going to decline even if the United States doesn't. Amitav Acharya, for example, has a book to that effect. I think that's probably incorrect in the following sense, that China gets a lot of benefit out of this system. Unlike, let's say, Germany in the 30s or Stalinist Russia in the 50s, which were existential threats to the international system, China's not. The Chinese benefit from a UN Security Council seat. They benefit from being members of the World Trade Organization. When decisions at the dispute settlement mechanism and the WTO go against them, they obey the decisions, as does the United States. They benefit from a lot of this. If you say, does it matter if China develops in the AIIB or the Asian Infrastructure Investment Bank, I think that's a plus. I mean, I don't see this as I think the Americans were foolish to oppose it. It is China's contribution to public goods. If they recycle some of their reserves into creating infrastructure in poor countries, we should welcome that. And the idea that it means the end of the World Bank, it just doesn't follow. There are already many development banks on a regional basis. I think the Chinese incentive is to have a larger share of the system, and that makes sense. And the fact that you'll have some institutions based in Beijing, that makes sense. But I don't see the Chinese trying to destroy the IMF, the WTO, the UN, or otherwise. So I believe that, in fact, the Chinese are not likely to be a power that tries to overthrow the system, but tries to increase its role in it.
And moving forward, I read an article by Stephen Walt, I'm sure you know recently, and his main question in the article was, where does America draw the line, if so? As we're moving towards 2030, if America will pursue a power-sharing agreement with China of some sort, let's assume that it will, and it wants to avoid conflict, will America draw the line somewhere? And if so, where will that be? Where will it sort of say, enough's enough, we need to do something about this?
Well, there are different ways of thinking about lines and drawing them. I think Steve Walt's argument is overly simple. I mean, that there's one point in which you draw a line. You could say that what we've seen in the last week in the South China Sea was a drawing of a line. China has a 9-dashed line which it draws around the South China Sea, so that the South China Sea, within almost 1,000 miles south of China, is encircled by these lines on the map. China has never properly defined what that line means. And the United States has said, we do not take a position on the issue of sovereignty, where China contests some of these 250-odd features in the South China Sea with Vietnam, Philippines, Malaysia, and so forth. We don't take a line on sovereignty. We do take a line that the ocean should be governed by the international law of the sea with free navigation. And the Chinese have said, well, we accept free navigation, but they've never been clear about what that means. And so as they dredge sand and fill in these islands on 5 different features, atolls and shoals and so forth, if they were then to claim a 200-mile exclusive economic zone around each of these new artificial islands, they could close off a large part of the South China Sea. So when the United States flew a naval reconnaissance aircraft right over Fiery Cross Reef, or right along Fiery Cross Reef, with a CNN crew on board, making it clear this wasn't a secret surveillance, this was to say we do not accept this as sovereign territory, that's drawing a line. I suspect the net effect of that is going to be negotiations. I hope that that will lead to US-China negotiations about what is the meaning of the 9-dashed line. So it's not one line that's drawn. Or to give you another example, China declared in 2013 an air defense identification zone over the East China Sea, which included the Diaoyu Senkaku Islands, which are disputed between China and Japan. They did this without any consultation with anybody else. They just said this is an air identification zone. The American response was to fly 2 B-52s right through the middle of it without alerting China, which was another way of saying we do not accept that this is your territory, that you can do this. That's drawing a line. It didn't lead to conflict. But I know it's not Steve Walt's argument that by 2030, where are we going to draw the line? Excuse me, we've been drawing lines right along. And along with drawing lines has to go negotiations.
Okay, I'll have one last stab before I open the floor up. We're discussing over dinner briefly Britain and the sort of the recent debate here, or the lack of a debate, about increasing our defence spending, and as well with sort of Euroscepticism, with a referendum approaching. How do you see Europe itself as a coherent actor playing a role on the international stage and engaging in the China-US dispute? We can see with Europe, China itself and Russia and other countries attempting to insert themselves within the European sort of debate as well. Greece, for example, in their current woes, are looking out to China. I think they persuaded Beijing to buy some of their bonds a few weeks ago. So do you see Europe itself as fundamentally riven by political disunity at the moment? And do you think that can you see Europe playing a much bigger role in this debate?
Well, I think Europe's going through a difficult spell now, but I think Europe still retains enormous capacity. I mean, when Europe acts as an entity, it is still an economy the scale of the United States. It also is the source of enormous technological capability, very important human resources. And it's also interesting in terms of the American point of view. There's probably no other part of the world in which we share more common values than with Europe. So having a strong and vibrant Europe, which is able to deal with many of these issues, is crucial, but also to deal with the issues I mentioned about producing collective goods. If you talk about climate change, monetary stability, dealing with pandemics like the Ebola crisis, if you deal with questions of terrorism, of cyber theft and so forth, the Europeans have to play a role. And so it's not either or. I mean, we're going to need cooperation with Europe and cooperation with China and cooperation with India and with others. So I tend not to be a Euro pessimist. I don't know what will be the outcome of the particular Greek situation, but if you ask me, do I think Europe will fall apart? I think probably not. I think it probably will hold together.
That's reassuring. Okay, let's open up the floor to questions. We've only got, I think, just over 20 minutes, so if everyone can, there are 2 microphones going around, I think. One's here. If I pick you out, if you keep your question as short as possible, so we can get as many as possible in. Nick, you wrote an article. Let's have you first.
So, of course, it's not just the other party in discussion about America and China is China, and China is itself a land, like a country of contrast, Guangdong province's GDP per capita is the same as Switzerland's. You've got relatively liberal and technocratic politicians like Wang Yan and more populist and hardliners in the military, and until his arrest, Bo Xilai. How, I understand that this is speculation, but how do you see China's, or elements within China's view of themselves and their role in this order as it continues to build capacity, as it's trying to transition to a more stable level of growth? How do you see this, its role, its view of its role of itself changing?
Well, China knows that it has to change its growth model, that if it doesn't, if it remains labor-intensive growth, they've reached a demographic transition where the labor force essentially is peaking this year, and it needs to make change. It doesn't quite know how to do it, but if they don't, they may run into this so-called middle income trap. But I think there's another problem that China faces, which is we know that when countries reach about $10,000 per capita income and purchasing power parity, there are increased demands for participation. And China hasn't figured out how to deal with that. So the question of how can you cope with this? How do you deal with the demands for participation? How do you adapt the growth model so that you continue to have the progress they've had? I don't think even Xi Jinping knows the answer to that. I mean, they're experimenting, they're trying, but I don't think anybody knows the answer. I happen to believe that they will figure this out. I mean, I'm not a bear on China. I think there's a great exaggeration of Chinese power, but that doesn't mean that I think China's about to fail. There are some experts on China who think they're going to hit a major bump in the road. For example, David Shumbaugh had an article in the Wall Street Journal a few months ago talking about the coming collapse in China. So there are people who disagree with it. I think there's going to be a slowdown. I think they face bumps in the road relating to demography and to political participation. I suspect they'll work their way through it.
Yes, gentlemen, just in the navy blue shirt. Just there. Got it?
Thanks, Professor Nai, for your insightful lecture. So in any shift in the landscape of power brings in need for new friends and new alliances. So in the context of China's emergent dominance, how do you see US's relationship with India forging, A, in the context of the world stage, and B, in the local geopolitical situation vis-a-vis Pakistan?
I think that U.S.-India relations are likely to improve. I don't see an alliance between India and the U.S. I don't think India wants an alliance. But I think as India looks over its shoulder or over the Himalayas and looks at the growth of China, it realizes that better relations with America are useful to it. And I think the Americans see it the same way. It's interesting to see Prime Minister Modi's recent visits. He wants good relations with China for trade purposes, but he also wants to make sure that China is aware that there are Indian security concerns about China's behavior both on the border in India, but also in the Indian Ocean. Those lead me to believe that you're likely to see an improvement of U.S.-Indian relations.
Gentleman in the middle. Just there.
So I'm curious what you think about what I see as under Xi Jinping's ascendance to power in China, essentially a real about-face in domestic Chinese politics, in one, a return to, if not totally Maoist, closer to Maoist party discipline, rising crackdowns on internet freedom, privacy, and then also the continued expeditions and island building in the South China Sea. So I think those three things are indicators that China's, I don't know, it seems like for much of the beginning of the 21st century, there was an idea that China's rise would be one of liberalization, one of economic growth and largely on Western terms. And I think there's been a change where they're trying to now define it, their rise, whether or not they catch up with the US on their own terms. And so what would you say that's the correct analysis? And second, what does that implications does it have for the entropy you talked about?
Well, China has been going through a period of internal crackdown. Many Chinese describe a state of fear. Chinese friends have described this to me when I've been in Beijing. There's also the crackdown on corruption, which means that many Chinese worry about where will the axe fall next. But the crackdown on nonprofit organizations, on press freedoms, on academic freedoms, those are worrisome. Some people see this as a return to what they call neo-Maoism. On the other hand, if you look at the power that Mao had and the power that Xi Jinping has, it's really quite different. There's been much more institutionalization of the Chinese leadership. Xi Jinping is clearly the strongest leader we've seen since Deng Xiaoping, but he doesn't have the same authority individually that Deng Xiaoping had. So in that sense, you have a trend toward greater institutionalization and reduction of the power of a single figure that is going on. And at the same time, the dominant single figure right now, Xi Jinping, is trying to strengthen his position by clamping down on many of these freedoms that had been growing in the previous period. Where this is going to work out is very unclear, and it intersects with that question I raised earlier of what happens as you have increased demands for participation. So I think my answer to that is stay tuned. We're seeing the first act of a multi-act play.
Question, Madam.
Hi, I've got a question that's come through from Twitter, so it's not my own. Will China be a free rider in the future, given that unlike the US in the 20s, it's not pursuing an isolationist foreign policy?
I think China does like to say very often, we don't interfere in the internal affairs of other countries. Well, that's a nice principle, but it also means that China often can be a free rider. In other words, it can take minerals or resources without, essentially providing public goods. But I think that's beginning to change. I think the Chinese are really realizing that they are playing a large enough role in the international economic system that they can't afford that type of free-riding behavior. The question is, will they make these changes rapidly enough? There's some signs that they will. China is is the largest contributor to UN peacekeeping forces among the permanent members of the Security Council. I would regard China's setting up the AIIB as a good thing, as I mentioned earlier. So I think China is probably not going to be as bad in terms of free riding as the United States was in the 1930s.
Go back, Madam.
Thank you. My question is regard of the South China Sea conflict. So there's some hope in Vietnam that the U.S. may be sided with Vietnam in terms of, is there any conflict with China? So it is a very unfounded or unreasonable hope from Vietnamese. And also, what would you predict to be the U.S. reaction if there is something like military actions or kind of war between China and Vietnam? Yeah, thank you.
Well, Vietnam obviously has great concerns about China. It has a number of disputes on particular islands. Most recently, there was an oil rig which was parked, I guess, in the Paracel Islands, which Vietnam claimed and China claimed. And you had not merely boats from China and Vietnam ramming each other and shooting water cannons at each other, but it was followed by riots, anti-Chinese riots in Vietnam. So there are real difficulties there. The United States has been loath to become involved on the territorial disputes in terms of who is right and wrong. The reason for that is a lot of these claims in the South China Sea are very debatable. It's not clear that China is always wrong. It's not clear that China is always right. What the United States has been saying is keep the seas open and free for navigation, and then settle these different types of disputes through mediation, arbitration, and so forth. So I doubt that the United States wants to get into the business of, let's say, protecting a Vietnamese claim to a particular island or reef or something. This is a little different from the East China Sea, where the United States has said that the Senkaku Diaoyu Islands were returned to Japan as a result of the reversion of Okinawa to Japan in 1972, and therefore the U.S.-Japan Security Treaty covers the Senkaku Diaoyu Islands. So in that case, the U.S. is committed under Article 5 of the Security Treaty to protect Japan if China were to attack on the Senkaku Diaoyu Islands. But the United States doesn't want to get in the business of, with 5 different nations contesting China in the South China Sea, some of whose claims are better than others, and also where there are contests among the 5 nations as well as with China. The United States has said, no, we're not going to get into the sovereignty issue. We're into the freedom of the seas issue, not the sovereignty issue.
There's a lady at the back with the red hand. Okay, thanks. Then we'll come to you.
Thank you, Professor Nye. My question
Hold the mic a little closer to you.
is fine. Okay, my question is regarding China's positioning in the international community vis-a-vis its non-interference in other states' affairs. All great powers do that. But do you think this is going to change in the future? I was following a development with Chinese. There was a start of a strategic relationship with the Afghan police training, and this led to some doubts about China's future goals. Would that be a threat to the United States? So that's my question.
What was the particular case you mentioned?
The Chinese vice premier, he had visited Afghanistan when President Karzai was in
Oh,
power.
I see, yes.
And they forged a strategic cooperation agreement, which was going to train, the Chinese were going to train Afghan police.
I personally regard that as a good thing. I mean, if China wishes to help the Afghan government by training its army, by developing resources, by providing its aid to Afghanistan, we should welcome it. I would argue this is an example of China not free riding, but helping.
Question here, was it? Sir, yeah. Just in the back. We'll come to you. Next one.
Hi. You've spoken a bit about China's role with other non-Western countries and in the South China Sea and investing in infrastructure in places, but they've also arguably been quite exploitative with other countries' resources. So do you think that in general they are the friendly elder brother that they act as and have been for about 70 years, or do you think they're becoming almost colonialist in how they're treating other countries?
China likes to, China's aim is to get resources to continue its economic development. That's its primary interest or purpose. So very often when it goes to Africa or Latin America, it's focused on those resources and getting access to them. When China behaves in too crude a manner on that, it creates resentment, which undercuts Chinese soft power. So for example, in countries like Zambia, you've had riots against Chinese mine managers and so forth. One of the problems is that China often brings Chinese labor to develop the infrastructure to exploit the resources, and that's often resented by the local people. So I think one of the things that China is going to have to learn is to be more sensitive to the concerns of local people. I personally don't think there's a great problem of competition with China for resources between the U.S. or the West and China. I do think there's a problem that countries have in terms of how they bargain with China, in terms of the conditions of the sale of these resources. Chinese demand for resources has actually helped economic growth in both Africa and Latin America. But the terms of the bargaining are things where I think you can see or hope for some improvements. So I don't see a great conflict over resources. I think the terms of the bargains are likely to change over time because African people don't want to be ruled by Europeans, but they don't want to be ruled by Chinese either.
I think the gentleman in glasses just there. And that's pretty much how do you
Hello? Can you hear me?
Yes.
Okay, good. When you made your case earlier why the U.S. was not in absolute decline, it seemed that you made a purely economic case, I guess to some extent demographic, but you didn't really address at all the argument that you mentioned earlier that the U.S. seems to be in some sort of political decline, that this gridlock in Washington seems to be preventing the U.S. from acting in sort of properly. Do you believe that that does not matter? Is that not a source of concern, or do you believe it will get resolved somehow? Or well, why is this not a source of concern?
I think it is a source of concern, and I basically didn't go in. I mean, there is a discussion of it in the book, but I was told 30 minutes for presentation, so not everything got included tonight. I think the United States is in a period of retrenchment, not isolation, but retrenchment in foreign policy, which is a reaction against the maximalism of the invasion of Iraq, which was a huge mistake. In some ways, we're going through a period after Iraq analogous to the period after Vietnam. This is not the same as 1930s isolationism. The question is, it's cyclical. And whether that is also going to be true of the political gridlock that we're seeing, particularly as it affects foreign policy, or not, we just don't know. I think it's probably cyclical. It's worth remembering that the United States government was created to prevent King George ruling over us, or anybody else for that matter. It was designed to have checks and balances, which meant that the American government was designed to be inefficient right from the start. People forget that George Washington's Secretary of State was Thomas Jefferson, who opposed Washington's major accomplishment, which was the Jay Treaty with Britain, and Jefferson tried to scuttle it in the Congress. So we've been at this for a long time. Right now, I think we're in a low in terms of partisan divisions. Whether this will continue or whether that cycle will turn, I suspect it will turn. But the point is, even if it doesn't turn, there still will be, I think, costs to American power, but not totally debilitating costs. The analogy that with Rome that I was referring to, it's worth remembering that the Romans were actually killing each other. So far, except on House of Cards, I don't think presidents have actually gone that far.
A couple more. And Claudia, have one microphone here? And then,
Well, this actually follows on quite well from what you were just saying. But obviously tonight is about visions and looking forward. But as a classics student, I was quite interested to hear your allusions to ancient Rome and Greece. And so my question is, given the social and technological changes of the past 2,000, 2,500 years, how useful do you think it is to draw comparisons and analogies to ancient civilizations and indeed other periods in history?
I think there's a limited value from these analogies to ancient Rome and Greece. Because if you look at Rome, you had economic growth through extensive rather than intensive means. You got richer by conquering your neighbor. And today, you get richer by increased productivity in your economy, which comes from technological innovation and application of technology and labor. So I think there are major differences in that sense. Where you can make some useful analogies is to realize that it takes a long time for a country or an empire to decline. If you look at ancient Rome, it's really about 3 centuries between, let's say, Trajan or Diocletian and the collapse of the Western Rome in 476. So it helps us to realize that our time horizons when we talk in terms of a century are very arbitrary. I mean, you know, what we call the Roman decline was several centuries. So that's useful, but the causes, I think, are just very different.
Last question. Is the gentleman, your hand's no longer up. It's gone down. No, is the gentleman behind you in the very back, in the blue? Yeah.
Hi, thank you. I think you argued like China being the free rider like in the past years, which seems to be not right in your point of view. But actually China is trying to put their influence in the South Sea, and they're like criticized for putting the influence. Could I ask your view on that? Like, will that cause some kind of change in the relationship between China and the U.S.?
Well, on the issue of the South China Sea, I don't think it needs to be something which is going to be a major change of China-U.S. relations. I write a column every month for Project Syndicate, and the column that was published today was, the question of the column was, will there be a U.S. conflict with China in the South China Sea? And my answer to that is no, I don't think there will be. Now, that doesn't mean it's impossible. Errors can be made on both sides. Miscalculations can be made. We can mishandle it on both sides. But in principle, since China admits that the idea that the South China Sea is not a Chinese lake, it accepts freedom of navigation, there's room to bargain over what is the meaning of these new artificial islands. Under the law of the sea treaty, they don't have the right to an exclusive economic zone. And if China is willing to agree to that, then the disputes between the United States and China in the South China Sea, I think, will not get out of control.
Well, on that optimistic note, I think that's all we've got time for questions. That's it, Daniel. Sorry, everyone, if I didn't get you. Do come to the drinks reception afterwards. I think Joseph is going to be around for a little while, so you can get your questions hopefully, and then hand back to Dan.
Thank you, Rupert. And please join me in thanking Joseph Nye. Thank you very much, Joseph, for your brilliant talk and discussion and for taking the time to come and speak to us this evening. We really do appreciate it. This has been IRSoC's final speaker event of term. What a way to finish. However, we do still have a social event coming up this Sunday. We're hosting a summer barbecue in University Parks. The weather looks set to brighten up for us over the weekend, so do come along and enjoy the sunshine, a burger and some Pims with us. That's between 2 and 4 p.m. on Sunday. It'd be great to see you all there. For more information, please see our Facebook page, and also don't forget to check out our brand new website at www.oxirsoc.com. Please also join us now for a drink reception in the room next door.
Book signing.
Book signing, yeah, I'll get to that for sure. Just to the right as you leave. Wine and juice will be available if you're a member of IRSoC or are one of our VIP guests this evening, which includes our guest students from UCL and Nottingham. And also any writers, editors, and sub-editors of this new issue of Sir, you may enter the drinks reception free of charge. If, however, you are not a member, we will be asking for a small contribution of £2. We have a list of names, so please check with the IRSoC committee member on the door whether or not you'll need to pay. Joseph and I will be there. So it's a great opportunity to speak to the man yourself and to even perhaps ask him to sign the copy of his book that you bought earlier this evening. Finally, from me, there are quite a few thank yous I would like to say quickly. Thank you to the Brussels School of International Studies for sponsoring CERN its launch event tonight. Thank you to IRSoC sponsors Morgan Stanley. Thank you to the Oxford Martin School for being a brilliant host venue, as always, not just tonight, but throughout my time on the committee of IRSoC. I'd like to thank you for everything that you've done to help IRSoC over the past few terms. It's truly been a pleasure working in partnership with you. I'd like to thank Rupert for his hard work constructing a brilliant new issue of Sir, and a special note of thanks goes to Chihiro, our graphics and design officer, for her brilliant work putting this issue of Sir together. A huge thank you to all of you for coming this evening, and also to those who joined us online. A very special thank you again to Joseph Nye, and as this is my last speaker event as IRSoC, as president of IRSoC, I'd like to take this opportunity to thank the amazing IRSoC committee. Without them, running our events would be near to impossible. It's been an absolute pleasure working with you, and thank you all so much for your consistent hard work and determination throughout for the society this term. You've helped, you've helped make my tenure as president really very enjoyable indeed. So thank you very much. And with And with that, I would just like to introduce you very quickly to our current president-elect, Megan Eldred, who will be taking over from me and guiding IRSoC into Michaelmas term. Please join me in congratulating Megan on her accession to becoming the new president of IRSoC.
Okay, I'll be brief so we can get to the drinks reception, but thanks to Dan for the last 2 terms of hard work that he's put in for IRSoC. I think we couldn't be ending on a better note with Joseph Nye's fantastic speech. We now look towards Michaelmas, and for all the IRSoC members in the room, we're holding our elections on Monday of 8th week at 6 p.m. in Trinity, and I encourage you all to apply for committee. We're hoping to put together a great term card for Michaelmas. But that's about all for me, and we'll see you at the drinks reception. Thank you.